Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program is about to begin. At this time, we ask you to turn off all electronic devices. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. William Inboden.
Good evening. Welcome to the Reagan Library. My name is Melissa Giller. I am the Chief Marketing Officer for the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Before we begin, in honor of the men and women who defend our freedom around the world, if you could please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. A year and a half into his presidency, President Reagan stood in Westminster Palace and declared before the British Parliament and the world that freedom and democracy will leave Marxism and Leninism on the ash heap of history. In that speech, President Reagan didn't just lay out his foreign policy. He called for America to support a global campaign for democracy. It was a turning point in the Cold War. It was a turning point in history. It is so significant and central to the Reagan presidency that we celebrated its 40th anniversary here at the Reagan Foundation and Institute just this year. That speech also provides the opening scene for the new book, The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink. It's the book written by our guest tonight. He's the executive director of the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas, Austin. Here at the Reagan Library, we are so grateful for Dr. Inboden's incredibly thoughtful scholarship. A book like this is no easy task. It was almost a 10-year process. He practically took up residence here at the Reagan Library, we learned, for almost a half a year, all combined, as he carefully combed the archives to get every detail just right. Perhaps that's why this book is quickly becoming regarded as the authoritative, comprehensive history of the Reagan administration's foreign policy. And I'd like to emphasize the word comprehensive because have you seen the size of this book? But don't be intimidated. It is extraordinarily accessible, which in my view makes it even more valuable. For decades, Dr. Inboden has worked at the crossroads of government and academia. He served on the National Security Council, on the State Department's policy planning staff, and as a congressional staff member. He's been widely published. He teaches some of the most popular classes at UT's LBJ School, and he serves on the CIA's Historical Advisory Panel and State Department's Historical Advisory Committee. Now, we don't have time to talk about all of his accomplishments because we want to talk with him about The Peacemaker. What did he uncover while working on the book? What lessons does it have for us today? And how did a Californian's sunny optimism ensure that Soviet communism would indeed end up on the ash heap of history? So ladies and gentlemen, here to bring us the answers, please welcome Dr. William Inboden. So thank you for joining us. I just had the pleasure of speaking with him for about a half an hour in the green room and got a whole bunch of more knowledge on the book. I wish you all could have heard that. But one of the things I did share with you down there is I really enjoyed how this book really reads like a novel, not like a history book. And so I want to know what inspired you to write the book that really is now being called the book on Ronald Reagan's national security policy.
Well, thanks so much, Melissa, and great to be with all of you here tonight. As Melissa mentioned in her introduction, I spent a total of about somewhere between 6 and 8 months here at the Reagan Library upstairs in the archives researching this book. So this became a home away from home in a lot of ways. It's great to be back. As Melissa mentioned, in my day job, I'm a professor at the University of Texas. And one of the reasons why I wrote the book the way I did actually came from teaching this current generation of college students, all of whom were born after the peaceful end of the Cold War. And not to criticize my students, but I started realizing that there was this growing mentality among a lot of them and a lot of other Americans that of course the peaceful end of the Cold War would happen. It was almost inevitable. Of course the world would not be destroyed in a nuclear apocalypse. Of course the Soviet Union was weak and was going to crumble apart. But some of you here in the room may be old enough to have remembered the Cold War. I grew up in the early days of the Cold War. I can remember it. It didn't seem that way at the time. And what I wanted to do in writing this book is try to recapture for readers what the world looked and felt like to President Reagan and his team, as every day they were going into the West Wing, into the Oval Office, making incredibly difficult decisions with quite literally the fate of the world hanging in the balance, and pursuing a much more confrontational posture towards the Soviets. I think one that was very much warranted, and we can talk more about what that looked like. But getting incredible criticism from the media, from congressional Democrats, from so-called foreign policy experts at the time saying, this won't work, you're wrong, the Soviet Union is strong and durable and it's going to last forever, and we just need to manage our relations with it. There's no way it could actually be defeated. Or, we can't believe you're pursuing this military buildup and calling them the evil empire, or saying they'll end up on the ash heap of history because that's just going to provoke a nuclear war. And so what I wanted to recapture in writing the book as a narrative where, events unfold in sequence is that President Reagan and his team, even though they were rightly confident in their strategy, they didn't know the story was going to end well. No one could know that for certain. And most of the experts and critics thought otherwise. And so in some ways, like I said, I wrote it for my students. They can now understand that we were very fortunate to have the leader we had at the time in the White House. And even though we know now that the story ended well, people didn't know it at the time. That said, if you do read the book, don't worry, the good guys win in the end. So, okay.
Well, and to that point, it was one of the things that I kind of noticed as I was reading the book. Reporter after reporter after reporter, including Tom Brokaw, scholar after scholar after scholar, scoffed at what he was doing.
Yeah.
How did he keep his resolve? How did he keep going forward, just pushing through, knowing it was the right thing to do?
Yeah, this is where one of the, insights or revelations from my research is President Reagan really was a man of ideas. He wouldn't call himself an intellectual, and that's not by any means a criticism, but he took ideas seriously, and he saw the Cold War as primarily a battle of ideas. So just about every previous Cold War president, Democrats and Republicans, had seen the Cold War as primarily a great power contest between two powerful countries, the United States and the Soviet Union. And it happened to be, we're a democracy and they're a totalitarian dictatorship. President Reagan reversed that. He saw the Cold War as primarily a battle of ideas between the free world, between America's free enterprise democracy and totalitarian communism with its command economy and its dictatorship and its repression. He saw it as primarily that battle of ideas. And so for him, the Soviet Union was not a rival nation to be managed. It was a vile idea to be defeated. Okay? He also knew, of course, that they were a powerful nation, and that's why we had to do the military buildup and put the pressure on them that we did, and then do the diplomacy with them. But to Melissa's question about where he got the resolve to withstand this criticism, and from the so-called experts and from the media, including some in his own party, it's because he had been studying and thinking about the Soviet Union and the Cold War and the virtues of a free society for decades before he became president. And so he had the confidence that he had a much better formulation and strategy for this conflict. And he also could point out, the previous decades, there'd been no path to winning. And, he did not want this Cold War to continue forever. One more key to his confidence, and this was another revelation from my research, is his religious faith. He had a deep Christian faith. He believed very much that God was watching over him and guiding him. He had had this for most of his life, but it was especially reinforced after he survived the assassination attempt just 3 months into the presidency in March of 1981. And so when you believe that God is guiding you and protecting you, that certainly can give you, I think, a strength and a serenity to withstand it when the Democrats, the Washington Post, the New York Times are trashing you. So.
Well, and that answer about his beliefs and his ideals actually leads really nicely into my next question. So, Ronald Reagan's thoughts and opinions on the Cold War ending communism. He was giving speeches in the 50s about that.
Yeah.
And so in your book, you talked a lot about, in the beginning of your book, you talked a lot about the relationship that formed in the 60s between Ronald Reagan and Eisenhower, and all the advice that Eisenhower gave a younger Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
And one of the things in your book that you said is that Eisenhower told Reagan that the most successful use of military force was to win a victory without firing a shot.
Yeah.
You flash forward to the success, and Margaret Thatcher famously said that Ronald Reagan, literally word for word, brought an end to the Cold War without firing a shot.
Yeah.
So how much do you think of Ronald Reagan's sort of belief system and thought about military buildup actually came from Eisenhower?
Yeah, I think I'm glad you picked up on that, because that was, again, another interesting revelation from my research on the book, was the important role that Eisenhower played in the 1960s. And I think that's where a number of the seeds of President Reagan's thinking about the importance of military strength for an overall strategy, including for diplomacy, came from. But some of it also comes from him coming of age during World War II and seeing the importance of military strength to the Allied victory. And of course, that at the time was a hot war, but realizing that America, as the arsenal of democracy, had been able to dictate a lot of the final terms of the end of World War II. And so, and of course, that was very formative for Eisenhower as well. So I think these ideas from Eisenhower, it's quite a story. Many of you will know that President Reagan's kind of political debut comes in 1964 in the Goldwater campaign, when he gives that time for choosing speech. Eisenhower had been out of office for 4 years at that time, was in retirement, spending his winters in Palm Springs, and he watches Reagan's speech on TV, and he's really taken with this guy. And he says, wow, this is a great political talent. And so he writes him a letter saying, hey, let's meet, let's get to know each other. So, then Mr. Ronald Reagan goes to visit President Eisenhower in Palm Springs, and Eisenhower tells him, listen, you ought to think about running for governor of California. I really like your ideas, but I even think you may have potential to be president, and so let's talk about foreign policy. Let's talk about what I learned as General Eisenhower during World War II. And so over the next 4 years, they start meeting regularly for these series of discussion sessions, seminars, if you will. But fast forward to President Reagan's strategy to actually win the Cold War. He absolutely wanted to win it. He wanted to defeat Soviet communism, as I mentioned earlier, but he wanted to keep the Cold War cold. He did not want it to turn hot, because that would have meant the death of all of us. And so that's why there's this much more sophisticated understanding we now have of his defense buildup, that it was designed to win without fighting, to force the Soviets to have to negotiate from a posture of weakness rather than strength. And this is why during his 8 years in office, even with presiding over a massive military modernization and being much more assertive in his rhetoric, he actually only deploys American ground troops in combat once in 8 years, and that's in the Grenada operation, which is it's significant but fairly small scale. It's over in just about three or 4 days, and so I think there's a great lesson to be taken away there on the importance of the American military for actually strengthening our diplomacy, and the fact that we have a military buildup doesn't mean that we necessarily want to get into some of these endless or prolonged wars without good outcomes that we've had in recent decades.
So we talked about President Eisenhower in the 1960s and how Ronald Reagan, got a lot of advice and learned from him. The other thing your book talks about, speaking of presidents, is once Ronald Reagan becomes president, he gets a lot of, I'll use the word advice, from President Nixon.
Yeah.
So can you talk about how President Nixon's relationship with Ronald Reagan helped or hindered the Reagan presidency?
Sure, yeah. This is, again, another one of these fascinating stories is the Reagan and Nixon relationship. And it's a very complicated one. At times, they are pretty fierce political rivals, especially those of you may be familiar with the 1976 campaign when Reagan is challenging Ford, of course, for president, but he's really running against Nixon's foreign policy. And it's one of those things where both of them have some common origins, right? So they're both born to very humble backgrounds in the Midwest, and then both make their way out to California for a new beginning, the land of opportunity, and both make their way up to tremendous success. both of them really, the two of them kind of dominate Republican presidential politics from the 1950s on up through the 1980s, right? So either a Nixon or a Reagan or something, both of them is on every ticket from 52 on up to 88, or strongly influencing it, as in 64. And yet they have different foreign policy visions. Nixon, of course, is the architect of détente, which is about coexisting with the Soviet Union. It's not surrendering to them. Nixon was not weak, but at the same time, Nixon did not believe that the Soviet Union could ever be defeated. He was more of the camp of, we just need to manage our relations with them. Let's contain them. Let's not let them get any further advances around the world, but let's not delude ourselves into thinking we can actually push back against them. And of course, when he becomes president in 1968, the quagmire of the Vietnam War, the United States was a weaker country and had a weaker hand. But they also have some differences in Asia. Nixon, of course, oversees the big strategic opening to China in 1972. Again, a bold and I think brilliant move at the time, so I'm not at all criticizing it. But President Reagan, when he looked east, when he looked to Asia, he saw Japan as the key to America's policy in Asia and China as secondary. Whereas Nixon, when he looked east, he saw, sorry, I'm doing the globe version. When they looked to the Far East, when they look west to the Far East, sorry, he saw China as the key and Japan as kind of secondary. But for Reagan, Japan at the time, the only democracy in Asia, America's most important security ally, and so they had their differences there. And yet, once President Reagan wins the presidency in November of 1980, there are at the time only 3 people alive on the planet who know what it means to be the President of the United States. Right? It is Gerald Ford, who, a wonderful man who had done some distinguished service, but at the time he's just not interested in politics anymore. He's mostly spent his time on the golf course. There's Jimmy Carter. Enough said about Jimmy Carter, right? And then there's Richard Nixon, who is living in kind of disgraced exile in New York at the time. And he starts writing these really interesting, thoughtful, moving letters to President-elect and then President Reagan, saying, essentially, I know we've had our differences before, but my only agenda now is to be a resource to you and to serve my country and to serve the Republican Party and to do all I can to ensure that your presidency is a success. And Nixon really means that. And Reagan, in turn, President Reagan, accepts that graciously, looks past their rivalry. And so over the next 8 years, there's a steady stream of correspondence. There's advice on politics. There's advice on policy. There's advice on personnel. Some of Nixon's advice on personnel is good. Other advice is not so good. And of course, President Reagan is very much his own man. He's making his own decisions. He's confident enough in himself that he'll take advice from anyone, but then he will make the decisions on what he actually wants to do. So it's a remarkable story.
So when we were downstairs, we were talking about the book, and I don't know if you've read it yet or not, but clearly it's a book on Ronald Reagan, but it's a book about all the people in and around Ronald Reagan, in the White House, around the world. This may be a hard question, it may be an easy question, but who, in your opinion, were the most pivotal players, both domestically and internationally, to help Ronald Reagan achieve his goals?
Yeah, great question. So if you do have a chance to read the book, and I hope you will, you'll find that, of course, President Reagan is a central actor in the story, in this narrative drama. But I try to spend a decent amount of time on his main advisors, his cabinet secretaries, his senior staff. The First Lady, Mrs. Reagan, plays a key role. Some of the key Allied leaders, Margaret Thatcher, in particular, Brian Mulroney from Canada. Of course, Mikhail Gorbachev makes a lot of appearances. And so there's a range of important folks in it. My takeaway with Reagan's team is it very much was a team of rivals. These are very capable, strong-willed people, devoted to serving him, devoted to serving our country, but not always in agreement with each other. And this comes with any White House. Again, I worked in the Bush 43 White House, was very honored to have done that, but there was plenty of staff feuding then. It just comes with the territory. But especially when the stakes are as high as they are in the 1980s, when, like I said, quite literally the fate of the world hangs in the balance, there's gonna be differences. And so one of the other themes of the book is how even amidst the staff feuding and differences, President Reagan was still able to achieve strategic successes. To Melissa's question about some of the most notable ones, Bill Casey, the CIA director, is just a fascinating character, really brings the CIA back to life after the horrible demoralization of the Carter years and some of the investigations of the 1970s, comes into the position really wanted to mobilize the CIA to wage war on Soviet communism, and has strong support from President Reagan in that. But at the same time, Casey had his differences with plenty of others in the administration. The two most important ones I think I highlight are Bill Clark, President Reagan's national security advisor for 2 years, who had previously been his chief of staff when he was Governor Reagan, one of his closest friends. Clark has been too much forgotten by history. He hasn't been treated kindly by some other memoirs written by some other senior Reagan staff. But I found through my interviews and through spending lots of time in the archives upstairs that a careful look at the historical record shows that as National Security Advisor, Judge Clark really saw it as his mission to take President Reagan's strategic ideas and implement them and get the American government to implement them. And even if you're the most powerful man in the world as the President of the United States, you can oftentimes feel powerless getting that massive bureaucracy of the U.S. government to do what you want, right? And so Judge Clark was, I think, very loyal to President Reagan, very committed to carrying out that vision, and very committed to cracking the whip to get the bureaucracy of the State Department and the Pentagon to implement President Reagan's strategy. And then the other one is George Shultz, the Secretary of State for 6.5 years. Very faithful lieutenant to President Reagan, also really understood his vision for bringing pressure on the Soviet Union, but also extending the hand of diplomatic outreach because he wanted to keep the Cold War cold. And he wanted to negotiate with the Soviets, especially Gorbachev, but he wanted to negotiate from a position of strength. And Shultz really got that. Schultz also really got President Reagan's vision for expanding freedom around the world, certainly for supporting Christian and Jewish dissidents behind the Iron Curtain, for supporting other democracy movements in Asia and Latin America, for building up a positive model of the free world as a contrast to the poverty and oppression of Soviet communism and of the communist bloc. And so there are many others I could highlight, but Clark and Schultz are the two that I particularly want to mention.
So speaking of people that Ronald Reagan worked with, Ronald Reagan takes office. He knows he wants to bring an end to the Cold War. He knows what he's got such a mission. The assassination attempt happens, and as he's recovering in the White House, he writes the letter to Brezhnev that pretty much is ignored, and then Brezhnev dies, and then Reagan tries it with the next Soviet Union leader, and he dies. And then he tries it again, and then he dies. So finally, Gorbachev takes office. What do you think made Gorbachev different than his predecessors that allowed him to be open? And obviously, if when you read the book and if you know a lot about the different summits, you see it wasn't easy. It still took a lot of negotiating, but he obviously was open to that negotiations. What do you think made him different?
Yeah, so, and again, to clarify, I don't speak Russian. I didn't do research in the Russian archives, and so I certainly spent a lot of time trying to read about and study and understand Gorbachev, based on a lot of translated documents and interviewing other people who'd worked with them. But to answer Melissa's question, and Melissa, I'm going to give you a direct answer on that in a second, but I want to give a little bit of context here. There is a debate among a lot of scholars and others that lived at the end of the Cold War over who deserves more credit for the peaceful end of the Cold War, Reagan or Gorbachev. Now, in truth, they're both essential. Okay, President Reagan himself would have said that Gorbachev was essential. But I am concerned that too many scholars of late have been giving Gorbachev more credit and treating Reagan as kind of lucky to happen to have been there at the time and, clever enough to go along with Gorbachev's bold and ambitious reforms. And I think that is fundamentally wrong. And here's why I give Reagan more credit than Gorbachev, but also why they are able to make an important partnership. President Reagan becomes president. He takes the oath of office January of 1981. Gorbachev takes power, is selected by the Politburo as the final Soviet dictator in March of 1985, over 4 years later. What I found, in my research in the archives upstairs, reading recently declassified National Security Council documents and strategy memos from the Reagan White House, is from the beginning, President Reagan was very clear that his strategy to win the Cold War, to put pressure on the Soviet Union, to weaken the Soviet economy, to deter the Soviet military, included this very specific notion that he wanted to pressure the Soviet system to produce a reformist leader that he could negotiate with, okay? And it is that explicit, right? So over those next 4 years, dealing with Brezhnev and Andropov and Chernenko and them, defying President Reagan's efforts at outreach and feeling embattled by his pressure, all along, President Reagan was looking for a reformist Soviet leader, and not just passively waiting and hoping one comes along. That was part of his strategy. And so that's why the chapter in my book on when Gorbachev comes to power is called Waiting for Gorbachev, little play on Waiting for Godot. Because President Reagan had been looking and wanting and pressuring the Soviet system to produce a reformist leader, that's why he recognized one when Gorbachev finally came along. Now, I'm not saying that Ronald Reagan all by himself forces the Soviet Union to select Gorbachev, okay? It's not, Gorbachev's selection is a product of a number of internal Soviet factors as well. But scholars, I hope they will take this argument seriously, because I hadn't seen any come up with before, need to appreciate that was a very explicit part of President Reagan's purpose, was to pressure that Soviet system to produce a reformist leader. To feel like we've got no other choice. Our old ways of doing things are completely collapsing. We got to turn to a reformer. And so, more directly to Melissa's question about what Gorbachev was thinking. Gorbachev shared Reagan's goal of avoiding destroying the world in a nuclear war. Okay, so he was committed to that, and Gorbachev generally wanted to ease some of the repression within the Soviet system. He wanted to improve its totally decrepit, sclerotic economy, which couldn't feed its own people, which is why they need to rely on American farmers exporting wheat to them, right? But at the end of the day, their goals do diverge. President Reagan wants to defeat and collapse Soviet communism. Gorbachev wants to reform and preserve Soviet communism. And so they have very heated debates and discussions at their 4 summit meetings in Geneva and Reykjavik and then Washington, D.C. and Moscow. Gorbachev recognizes what Reagan's strategy is. He even calls him out on it and says, I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, but all right, Ron, they become on a first name basis. I know you're trying to pressure my system to collapse, aren't you? And President Reagan, well, Mikhail, yeah, but he's thinking, yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing, right? But let's do it without causing the world to be destroyed in nuclear war. And finally, I've gotten a lot of questions in different talks and interviews about the title of my book, why I titled it The Peacemaker. That title comes in part from Gorbachev. It's a tribute he paid to Reagan at Reagan's funeral when he makes a surprise visit to the Capitol Rotunda where the President Reagan's body is lying in state there, and Gorbachev says he was my friend and he was a great peacemaker. So it's peace through strength. I'm very, very, very clear on that. But to the left-wing critics who don't like the title of the book, I say, take it up with Gorbachev, not with me.
Well, speaking of left-wing critics, so the Congress and the Senate and the American people are very divided by party lines. And so when the INF Treaty was signed, was there overwhelming relief that Ronald Reagan's policies had worked? Or were people on the left just saying, oh, it was going to happen? Reagan had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, and this is where we look back now, and so many people can, I think, rightly recognize the INF Treaty. And for those of you who may not recall, it's the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and it was one of President Reagan's many signature achievements of abolishing an entire class of nuclear weapons, really to the advantage of the United States, because the Soviets had previously had a tremendous edge in that. Just to give you a little bit of the technical details, because they really matter on how devilish these weapons were. In the late 1970s, sensing Jimmy Carter's weakness, the Soviets had deployed hundreds of SS-20 missiles on the essentially on the far western frontier of the Soviet Union, where they're all just about 8-minute flight time from any NATO capital, from Bonn, as well as West Berlin, from London, from Paris. And these missiles were MIRVed. Each one had 3 warheads on it. They were mobile. They were solid fueled. Any of you who understand the technical details here, means they were pretty much undeterrable, right? They could be launched without warning. We couldn't necessarily detect them. And so so it's the Soviets' way of holding Western Europe hostage. And President Reagan, one of his goals from when he first takes office is to get rid of those Soviet missiles. And again, over tremendous opposition from the American left and from a lot of Europeans, he deploys American intermediate-range nuclear missiles throughout Western Europe. Our allies agree to do that. Our allied leaders agree to do it because they trust Reagan and they're very committed to him. It's a great picture of the importance of allies and the strength that they give us. But again, President Reagan doesn't deploy our nuclear missiles there because he wants to destroy the whole world, and he does it as a negotiating ploy. He's serious about doing it. Gorbachev says those American missiles are like a pistol pointed at the Kremlin's head. And that's exactly what they were. But because of that pressure, Gorbachev eventually agrees, okay, we will get rid of all of our missiles. The Soviets had also deployed those same missiles in the Far East, targeting Tokyo and Seoul, our allies there. They agree to get rid of them there as well. And so Gorbachev agrees to that. He signs that treaty with Reagan. But the way the American constitutional system works is when a treaty, it may be signed by the president, but needs to be ratified by the Senate. And so there's a real question, would Democrats and Republicans in the Senate agree to ratify it? Some of the liberals in the Senate couldn't believe this Reagan guy had done anything good they liked, and so they were skeptical of it, and they were saying, well, maybe this is destabilizing, right? And then even some, of the more, I wouldn't even say conservative, some of the more hard-right Republicans in the Senate thought that President Reagan was giving up too much, that he was relinquishing too much. And so he had some challenges to manage both the left and the right there. But he was a masterful negotiator, not just with Soviets, but also with members of Congress, who could be as difficult. And eventually the Senate did ratify it, something like 92-8.
And so speaking about the INF Treaty and the nuclear weapons, numerous times in your book, you mention how Ronald Reagan said that, or often said that a nuclear war cannot be won, so it should not be fought.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, you can't speak on behalf of Ronald Reagan, but through all the research that you've done and preparing for your book, how do you think he would feel today about the possibility of a nuclear war? I mean, the INF Treaty isn't even a treaty anymore.
Yeah. So again, I'm often asked questions about what would Ronald Reagan do today with any number of foreign policy issues, and I first have to give the disclaimer that I don't know. He's not with us. Obviously he's not with us anymore. We can't ask him. But then I can't resist speculating a little bit. Okay, so there's that. So first, I would say that he had, I think, a pretty sophisticated take on nuclear weapons, which is he appreciated their use for America's strategic strength, especially in deterring Soviet aggression. But he also hated them and thought that they were ghastly weapons that, again, could destroy the entire world. But he saw the biggest risk in the world of nuclear war was not necessarily America's nuclear arsenal, but rather Soviet communism. And so this is why, again, his peace through strength formula, he wanted to end Soviet communism along the way to then getting rid of nuclear weapons. But the sequencing is very, very important there. Others on the left who wanted complete nuclear disarmament, Reagan thought they were nuts. He said, look, we got to get rid of the Soviet Union first, then we can get rid of nuclear weapons. And this, of course, is his vision for SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which the missile shield that he wanted to build, and was very visionary, even if it didn't become operational at the time. And again, this really terrified Gorbachev. So that context is important for fast forwarding to today. The questions about when President Trump recently withdrew from the INF Treaty. I think President Reagan would have understood that decision and maybe even would have made it himself, because again, it's a very different strategic moment we're in right now, where the real strength of one of the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military, one of their core strengths is intermediate-range nuclear missiles. And they have hundreds of them targeting Taiwan, hundreds more targeting Japan, targeting our allies in Asia. And so in some ways, it is in Asia right now kind of a 1983 moment. And 1983 is the year that President Reagan deployed our intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe. And he wanted eventually to get rid of all of them, but he knew that he would not have a strong negotiating hand to force the Soviets to get rid of their missiles until we first deploy ours. So you got to point the gun at them, you got to cock the gun at them to then get them to negotiate. And so this is why, while I am very favorable to the INF Treaty in my book, I think it's one of his most remarkable strategic accomplishments. I also now in the year 2023, I'm glad that we no longer have that treaty, because I think we need to redeploy those missiles to counter China, and eventually maybe we can get to a better negotiating spot there. And so again, without presuming to speak for President Reagan, when we look at how he first deployed the missiles before negotiating the treaty, I think that sequencing really matters.
So speaking about Ronald Reagan and the rest of the world, so obviously I know that a U.S. president works not just for U.S. interests, but for international interests. Of course, I know everything that Ronald Reagan did for bringing an end to communism, ending the Cold War. But in reading your book, and that's something that people should know, this is not just about a book about Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev and communism. This is a book about the world. I mean, it's in your title, right? A World on the Brink. He did so much for the entire landscape of the world. So if you were to remove the Cold War communism part of your book, what might you say would be one of his other great accomplishments throughout his presidency?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking this, Melissa, because again, the Cold War, of course, is the central theme. It's there in the title. It's mostly what I've been talking about. But again, if you do read the book, you'll see that there's a lot of other issues in there as well. Counterterrorism, the Middle East, Asia, the international economic order. And going back to your first question about why I wrote it as a narrative, and I gave the main reason is I wanted to recapture what it looked and felt like for people at the time when making these really difficult decisions in the Cold War. But there's another reason, and this is one that I came to appreciate having worked in the White House myself, is presidents have to manage dozens, hundreds of really difficult issues all at the same time. And so even while President Reagan was pressuring the Soviet Union or negotiating with Gorbachev or making big decisions on our military modernization, he was also having to manage trade tensions with Japan and hostage crises and terrorist strikes in the Middle East, and the very worries about China's threats against Taiwan. All these other issues crashing in on him simultaneously. And I try to weave those through the book so that readers can understand, even while he's making these big decisions on the Soviet Union and the Cold War, he's dealing with 20 or 30 or 40 other issues. Not to mention, of course, the more mundane ones of, Miss Oklahoma came in to visit today, and, the fourth graders from Spokane who won the 4F contest are here. I'm not making light of these. These things are important for being the President of the United States, and they take up your time. I don't put every last one of those in the book on there. So to Melissa's question about some of his other big accomplishments, I'll just highlight two. He presided over not just the restoration of the American economy and bringing the United States back to being the leading economy in the world, but really a tremendous economic boom across the entire free world. European economies were a mess when he took office. Some of the Asian ones had been growing, but they had some real trade imbalances there. Latin America was mired in poverty, and he had a real vision for an open trading order for free markets everywhere. And if you look, the free world's economy really booms to the 1980s. And as the British economy gets better and the West German economy gets better and the Japanese economy grows, those also end up being really good for the American economy. But this is why there was by the time he leaves office, there's so much affection for him globally across the free world, as many of these, Canadians had been inspired by his example, and that's why they elected Brian Mulroney in 1984, committed to free markets. West Germans had been inspired by Reagan's example, and that's why they elect Helmut Kohl, who is much more committed to free markets. So I could go through. And another one is similarly the growth of political freedom and democracy. I'll just rattle off the countries that undergo peaceful democratic transitions, thanks in part to President Reagan's influence and leadership, all during this time. Taiwan goes from military dictatorship to democracy. South Korea, military dictatorship to democracy. The Philippines, military dictatorship to democracy. Chile, El Salvador, Argentina, Brazil, and about 15 others. All those take place peacefully. All those are supported by President Reagan and the United States. And of course, then, Central and Eastern Europe, which, shortly after he leaves office, go from communist dictatorships to peaceful democracies as well. But it is not just the growth of freedom with the collapse of Soviet communism, it is the global growth of freedom. There has never before in human history been a comparable growth in human freedom as there was in that 10-year period from 1980 to 1990. Almost all of it certainly influenced, inspired inspired by President Reagan's policies. And so that needs to be appreciated as a part of his legacy as well. And I hope my book helps tell that story too.
So I easily have probably one or two more dozen questions, but I think that was such a great ending to this conversation. So I want to actually open it up to you in the audience if you have any questions. We have a handful of staff in the back with microphones, so please wait for the microphone to come to you before you ask your question, because this is being recorded. I can't see us sitting down here to pick someone. It's fine.
No? Oh, thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm curious about what Reagan's position was on SDI in 1983. When he first introduced that notion, everybody thought that was crazy, and it wasn't just others. It was also some of the people in his own administration who thought, "What are you thinking?" How do you believe that he felt as he first introduced it?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's a really important episode in his presidency, and I'll give you a little bit more on the origins of it. The origins of SDI go back to 1979. Before he's out of the California governorship, he's getting ready to run for president, but he hasn't even declared his candidacy yet. In the summer of 1979. We'll call him Governor Reagan, even though he's out of the governorship at the time. Governor Reagan and a couple of aides visit Cheyenne Mountain outside Colorado Springs, where the NORAD headquarters are. Right, so it's buried, deep inside the mountain. It's the bunker where our radar systems are to detect Soviet missiles or other hostile activity coming over the North Pole. And Governor Reagan is being given the tour by the three-star general in charge. Who, by the way, the NORAD is also where they track Santa Claus on Christmas Eve. So anyway, so everyone should know about NORAD. Okay. So he's in this hardened bunker. He's seen, even by 1979 standards, as incredibly sophisticated screens, covering every wall there. And the general's telling him, Governor Reagan, if the Soviets launch, on that screen there, we can detect their missiles second by second as they're coming over the North Pole and then over Canada, and it's really precise. We'll know exactly where they're going. And then Governor Reagan asked what he thinks is the obvious follow-up question. Well, okay, so we can track the missiles, but what do we do to stop them? And the general says, oh, well, we can't do anything to stop them. Governor Reagan says, well, what if there's a direct hit even on this mountain where you are with a SS-18? That was the biggest Soviet nuclear missile. And the general said, oh, we'd be toast. And it was, we can look back and laugh now. It's kind of humorous. But at the time, it was really frightening and disturbing for Governor Reagan, realizing, okay, we've got this great technology to track these missiles, but we can't protect ourselves against them. This is insanity. And again, if there's any nuclear strategists in the room, you'll remember that there was actually an acronym for this, MAD. Mutual assured destruction. It's that we couldn't protect ourselves against Soviet missiles. So how do we guarantee the Soviets don't launch against us? Well, we threaten that we'll launch against them, and we'll destroy, we'll kill 100 million Russians, and then they will kill 150 million Americans. And so it was called the balance of terror, or mutual assured destruction. Well, that had kind of worked for the previous decades of the Cold War, and that the world hadn't been destroyed in nuclear chain. But that is nothing to rely on, right? What if there's an accidental launch? What if the radar has a glitch and the Soviets think we've launched when we haven't? And this actually happened a couple times. And so President Reagan, he had this great way of taking a very sophisticated concept and boiling it down to something simple. He said, well, what if our nuclear strategy was predicated on actually saving lives instead of killing them, right? On actually defending Americans rather than just threatening the Soviet people. And so based on that, he spends his first few years as president thinking about this, and could we actually do a missile shield? But it was a very radical idea. His Secretary of Defense wasn't real keen on it. His Secretary of State wasn't real keen on it. A couple members of the Joint Chiefs were. National Security Advisor Bud McFarlane was, and so he worked with that little team to come up with this idea of totally reframing the strategic balance in the Cold War by saying we will actually build a missile shield to defend ourselves. When he announces it, it is very controversial. And to give you the oversimplified controversy, most American scientific experts, nuclear scientists, physicists, all that, thought it wouldn't work, and so they opposed it. They said, "This won't work. This is a fantasy." Ted Kennedy calls it Star Wars. It's out of a science fiction movie. It won't work, so they oppose it. Most American arms control experts had become very committed to this mutual assured destruction. They actually thought President Reagan's SDI would work, and so they also opposed it, right? So half of them oppose it because it won't work. The other half oppose it because they think it will work, right? But everyone is opposed to it. The Soviets, meanwhile, are convinced it will work because they think American technology is so amazing, and we've got Silicon Valley and that kind of stuff, and so they're mesmerized by American technology. And so when President Reagan actually sits down with Gorbachev for these series of summit meetings they have, if you read the transcripts of these, and they're absolutely fascinating, like I said, I've read every word of them, Gorbachev is just terrified by SDI because he had thought that his ace in the hole was the Soviets had roughly twice as many nuclear missiles as the United States did, and they had bigger ones. Even though he knew that the Soviet economy was a mess, even though he knew that his people hated communism, even though he knew that their military was very demoralized, at least they had these big nukes which could blackmail the Americans. And when he sees President Reagan talking about potentially developing SDI, Gorbachev realizes, okay, now, the last good ace card I had to play, I can't play that anymore. And it plays a very important role in Gorbachev eventually conceding so much and the Soviet Union collapsing. So it's, again, for those the critics out there who say, Reagan wasn't a man of ideas, or he just did what his staff told him, or he's reading off the cue cards, the SDI story alone is a case study in presidential leadership. Of a president, going to even overruling his own advisors, overruling conventional wisdom and saying, no, we're going to do it my way because I think this is the best way, no matter what the critics may say. And I think history has vindicated him.
Great answer. Tricia had somebody here.
Yeah, mine's kind of an off-the-wall question. One, I thought Arkansas was the land of opportunity. You said California. And then did you have to come out here to write because there's no other conservative people at the University of Texas?
Anyway, well, they don't call it the People's Republic of Austin for no reason. So yes, I am something of a fish out of water there. And as I said, this really was a home away from home. No comment on Arkansas. So I'm actually a native of Arizona myself. My parents were, likewise came from humble backgrounds in the Midwest and moved to Arizona because it's better weather and the land of opportunity too. So, yeah.
And I think Tricia has someone right over here.
Oh, yes. Can you comment on the quality and the accuracy of the intelligence about the Soviet Union's capabilities and intentions that was brought to the president, and how he consumed and used that information? Because my recollection is there were problems in that area about that, with that intelligence, and he seems to have used it quite capably, even with its shortcomings. Can you comment on that?
Thank you for asking this question. Did you plant that question?
I did.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right. Okay, thank you for asking the question. Again, this is a really important part of the story. I hope, those of you, I'll quit plugging the book, but there's a lot on it in the book. And this is where we also benefit now as scholars from the last few years, quite a few CIA assessments and other records haven't been declassified. So I mentioned Bill Casey earlier as this, like I said, wonderfully energetic and creative CIA director. And Director Casey was very effective in getting the director of operations, these are the case officers, these are the spies, to be really much more aggressive in going after Soviet communism and supporting the Reagan doctrine. But Casey had some problems with a lot of the CIA analysts. I think the record shows that quite a few CIA analysts had a much more positive view of Soviet strengths. They thought the Soviet economy was much more durable, was going to continue growing at least 1% to 2% per year. They didn't see it as so vulnerable. They didn't see the Soviet political system as very vulnerable. And Casey himself would be frustrated at this, but he also said, all right, this is what the analysts are saying, I'm going to take it in. So President Reagan would be reading a lot of these CIA assessments, which were telling him that the Soviet economy was more robust and durable and was going to keep going, essentially telling him, your strategy of pressuring this economy isn't going to work. But this is where I go back to him being a man of ideas who would take as many inputs as he could, would read as much as he could, but also had some of his own convictions. And this is where I think there's two sources that come into him having the confidence to say, no, I think the Soviet economy is a lot more weak and vulnerable. Part of it is his core convictions. He just felt as a matter of principle that free markets are more efficient, are more productive, are more conducive to human prosperity and economic growth. And a command economy that does not respect property rights, that tells its people what they can buy and sell and own, which was very, very little, that is not even able to feed its own people, that needs to buy American grain, it just can't continue. And he thought, wait a minute, why are we even trusting a lot of these Soviet economic figures the Kremlin's producing? They're a bunch of lies, right? So part of it is based on his free market convictions. He was just very suspicious of some of these CIA estimates saying the Soviet economy is pretty strong. But there's another source that he was using. Remember, as I mentioned before, he's very committed to supporting Soviet dissidents, the Christians and Jews and political dissidents who did not like living under the Kremlin's tyranny and oppression, who would often be imprisoned for their criticisms and for working against it. And whenever he was able to get one of them freed from the Gulag, negotiate the freedom, and they would receive asylum in the United States, President Reagan would meet with them in the Oval Office. And he would talk to them. He'd say, tell me, what's it like living in the Soviet system? What do people think of the government? And he'd hear these stories from all these exiled Soviet dissidents about miles-long bread lines, and no one trusts the government, and you can't even trust the economic figures we're getting. He thought, wait a minute, I'm getting the CIA estimate with these charts and these figures saying, oh, they'll keep growing at 2% a year. But I'm hearing from dozens of these dissidents who have actually lived in that system that it's all a bunch of lies. And that also gave him the confidence to keep pressing. And so that's where, as much as I have, like I said, great respect and appreciation for so many friends and faithful Americans who've served in the CIA's economic analyses of the Soviet communism in the 1980s are not one of its best episodes. So.
There's a question in the front row, Tricia, if you can get this gentleman right here.
By the way, quick aside, Bob Gates, many of you may know, later became CIA director himself. He read my book in draft form, cover to cover, and sent me a very nice letter afterwards saying he thinks I got the story right about the CIA and admitting that they got a number of things wrong then too. So take it from Bob Gates if you don't believe in Inboden. So yeah, he's a wonderful man.
Reagan's first election took place against the backdrop of the Iranian hostage crisis.
Yeah.
And there were a few months in between his election and the inauguration. Did he come into office with an action plan to get the hostages out and to end the crisis?
So great question, and let me give you a little more context just on the challenges that he inherited. And this goes back to what I often try to remind my students on just what a difficult hand it was. So when he is elected in November of 1980, the United States is just in bad shape. At the forefront, of course, is at that point it had been a year and a half that 52 Americans had been held hostage by the radical Islamist regime in Tehran. I'll come back to direct answer to your question in a second there, but also. The Soviets had invaded Afghanistan a year before. The United States had withdrawn in disgrace from Vietnam just 8 years earlier. The last American combat troop had left Vietnam 8 years, almost to the day when President Reagan was inaugurated, right? So America just looked weak and humiliated. Our economy was a mess. We just looked weak and humiliated on the global stage, exemplified by the Iran hostage crisis. He, throughout the campaign, had very much wanted to see the hostages released. I think there is a myth out there about this so-called October surprise that some of President Reagan's emissaries had quietly asked the Iranians to hold on to the hostages until he becomes president. I don't think there's any evidence for that. But he and Carter were very fierce political rivals. There were back-channel discussions between the Carter administration and its hostage negotiators and the Reagan campaign, because the Carter people knew if Reagan does win, we want to make sure that his team is well informed when they're coming in. And he was getting some indications that the Iranians were ready to release the hostages. Then, a couple weeks before he actually is going to be sworn in, he and the the Carter administration both get word that the Iranians have decided they will release the hostages. And so he knows that he's not, assuming that that's going to actually take place, he's got the relief of knowing that they're going to be released. But the Iranians wanted to, partly because they feared Reagan, but partly because they hated Carter and wanted to humiliate him one more time. It even comes down to this: that the morning of the inauguration, as President-elect Reagan and outgoing President Carter are riding in the limousine down to the Capitol to take the oath of office, the Iranians release the hostages and they put them in the airplane on the tarmac in Tehran, but then they tell the airplane, you can't take off until Reagan is sworn in as president, because we don't want the Carter to get any joy out of this, right? It's a kind of the final symbolic humiliation of Carter. The plane won't actually take off until Carter is officially ex-president. So that's how it plays out.
Yeah. So we have time for one final question. I think Tricia has it right there.
I was going to ask, what was your perspective of the relationship between President Reagan and John Paul II and Lech Walesa in trying to enable the Polish people and the Eastern European countries to become free to the Soviet yoke, and also comparing the fact that they both were assassinated very closely in time to each other, and actually John Paul II by a Soviet-inspired Bulgarian secret agent?
Yes. No, a great question. Again, it's a very important part of the story. Even though President Reagan is Protestant, of course, John Paul II is Catholic, there's a strong and close partnership between them and a real personal affinity. And it goes back to when in 1978, when Pope John Paul II, becomes the first Polish Pope, the first non-Italian Pope in 500 years. Then Reagan is out of office. He's ex-Governor Reagan, but he's doing his weekly radio addresses. He devotes a couple radio addresses to how remarkable it is that there is this Polish Pope, especially on his first visit back to Poland, and seeing the tremendous acclaim. And he even then identifies it, saying this is going to be a very notable leader. He has clearly struck fear into the hearts of the Kremlin as well as the communist regime in Poland. And so he's predisposed to be very favorable to the Pope. Then, of course, as you mentioned, the assassination attempts become, in a very obviously tragic way, a key bonding moment. Only 6 weeks apart, I think it's late March and then early May, that President Reagan is almost assassinated and the Pope is almost assassinated. Both of them come within inches of death. If the bullet would have been just a millimeter, one way or another, and in both cases they would not have lived. And both feel that God spares them in part to bring down Soviet communism. And it forges a real bond between them, not just having survived that trauma, but like I said, this sense of doing God's will. And because President Reagan sees the Cold War as in part a spiritual conflict, he wants to do all he can to support Protestants and Catholics and Jews living under the tyrannical yoke of Soviet communism. He sees its atheism as one of its key vulnerabilities. And so, in addition to building a real friendship with the Pope, they forged, like I said, a very effective partnership. The CIA is very regularly sharing intelligence that we're getting, intelligence with the Vatican that we're getting from behind the Iron Curtain. Not all of it bad economic assessments. And likewise, the Pope's got a great network of sources of cardinals and bishops and priests behind the Iron Curtain, and he is sharing information with the CIA and the State Department that he's getting from there. So there's deep intelligence collaboration between the two. And of course, the solidarity movement in Poland is absolutely key. Seth Jones, a great scholar in Washington, D.C., has written a wonderful book on this called A Covert Action, all about the Reagan administration and the Vatican partnering to support the solidarity movement. Again, it's all about bringing pressure on the Soviet system from every direction, not just militarily, not just economically, but supporting peaceful people of faith living behind the Iron Curtain who detest the communist systems that are oppressing them, supporting them, keeping their flames of faith alive, keeping their protests alive. And this also, again, becomes very threatening to Gorbachev and the Soviet system. So it's a very important part of the story.
So I want to thank you for coming. And for all of you, I saw there were so many more hands up than we got to. So please, this book is a fascinating read. I've been here over 2 decades. I learned so much reading this book. So go buy a book, come into the bookstore to get it signed, and feel free to ask your question in there. And again, thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.